thank you. We are going to talk about rotational grazing and techniques for small farms. This topic can actually be covered in probably about a 4-day workshop. So in 30 minutes, it is very brief. It is very basic. And so you do have the slides at each location printed out to use as a reference to look back on when you're trying to find more information on a subject or a topic. So we did provide that for you. But we're going to touch on just some basics of rotational grazing and what it involves and how to move forward on your own small farm. So the definition of rotational grazing, or MIG, as you maybe have seen it referred to, management intensive grazing, by definition is the practice of moving grazing livestock between pastures or paddocks on a regular basis or as needed as your forage allows. A well-managed rotational grazing system really shows how to evaluate the nutritional and forage needs, make sure to assess forage quality and the quantity of forage you have, and then helps regulate the control of which parts of the range or the pasture that the animals have access to. So that is the definition. We're going to go into some advantages. There are lots and lots of advantages of rotational grazing. Many times, managing your grazing system benefits both economically, environmentally, and socially. But putting in that sustainable grazing system can take lots of time, trial and error to implement and to master. But if you do, the return is really, really great for your property, and it becomes a big asset to your enterprise. So some advantages include extending the grazing system so you can buy less feed and utilize the forage potential of your property. More uniform grazing that helps ensure some optimal regrowth of those grasses and pasture grasses. It helps ensure a higher forage quality, and by utilizing a grazing method that allows for some rest and regrowth of that grass. And then when you have a healthier grass, it means more productive and less weeds being able to attack that forage and taking over your pasture. So lots of advantages. It helps increase that forage production, helps increase your soil fertility, enhances and improves the soil health. You have a greater increase in resistance to any drought by having that vegetative cover on your property. There's less soil compaction, less waste, and then you get more of those undesirable plants to stay out of your property. But with rotational grazing, there is definitely no one size fits all at anyone's property. It's all trial and error and a lot of trying different methods and utilizing your resources that you have and looking at what you have on your property to begin. So there's lots of trial and error to fully maximize. Lots of variables that are included, including climate, the season that you live, your seasons, your rainfall amount. I know, North Idaho has a lot more rainfall than we do here in Southern Idaho. How many paddocks you have size for on your property, how susceptible your livestock are to a grazing system, what kind of forage you have available and the quantity of forage, and then, supplemental feed that you have available with your enterprise as well. There's definitely a good trade-off when your pastures are managed correctly between parasite control. So, we've heard a few speakers talk about how good it is to graze because you eliminate some of those parasites that can potentially be harmful for your animals. With your pastures and your grazing, a lot of different animals have different grazing styles. So knowing that grazing style for your particular species is really important. Knowing how they graze, how they react to grazing is an important key component. Cattle and horses, they cannot forage or graze less than 1/2 an inch tall, where sheep and goats can graze clear down to the soil surface. And then fowl, poultry, will strip the soil bare. So it's really good. We've talked a little bit about having a ruminant go through and graze, and then bringing in poultry to complement that, because they will go through and strip the soil bare, eating everything, including the roots and the insects and anything in between. So just knowing your grazing habits of your animals is really helpful and beneficial in figuring out your rotational grazing system. Now, when we continuously graze, you can see this picture. We have one side that is continuously grazed, and then we have another side on the other side of the fence that is rotationally grazed. When you are continuously grazing, it's much harder on your pastures. Livestock are selective, and so they will eat their favorite plant, just like us. We like things to taste good. So as they eat those plants that they desire more, they leave those less desirable species in the field. So selective grazing has a way of really altering the composition of that pasture. Animals prefer those certain species and repeatedly will graze them continuously and leaving those less desirable forages available. Over time, continuously grazing can destroy the preferred species, which will result in the less desirable species. And then pretty soon we have weeds that are dominating the pasture, which we don't want. On the opposite side, rotational grazing does require a lot more time, a lot more management skills. It's more intense, but your yields are a lot higher. Your pasture is healthier, your animals are getting more forage that is available, and everything, your costs go down with your feeding, and you have a better better pasture health. So the take half and leave half is a grazing philosophy that's been scientifically studied for lots of years. It's been determined that what happens above the soil has a huge effect on what's happening underneath the soil. So the more leaf area we take above the soil, the less we leave underneath for the roots to develop and grow. So you can kind of see this illustration showing, when we only take 10% of that leaf removal, we don't have any root growth that's stopped. But the more you take above the soil of that leaf, then the less likely your roots are going to grow back. So as you take more, over time, those roots diminish underneath the soil. And then that's where we have dieback, we have pastures that are unhealthy, we have undesirable species coming in, and it's over time you see a reduction in your pasture health. This graphic shows, it's a really good graphic, I think, that shows the relationship between stubble height, or the height of the plant after grazing, and general plant health overall. Plant roots tend to stay stronger and healthy when grazing periods are short. So when you graze that above ground grass in a short time and allow for a long rest and recovery period, you see the root response is really healthy. There's a lot of root mass underneath. When the grazing periods are long and the rest and recovery is short, we see a reduction in the root mass underneath. And over time, as we continuously do that, we see that those roots really diminish and our plant health is diminishing as well. Pretty soon, plant health, plant vigor decreases drastically, and we need to renovate the pasture, start over, because we'll probably have a lot of weeds taking over that pasture, which kind of leads into the next illustration as well. This shows the characteristics of grass plants. Each year, as you see in the middle there, each year the plant root system has to replace 30%. And that it needs that 30% to replace itself and expand itself. So when we are continuously grazing, like we showed in the last slide, we are reducing that root mass and its ability to replace itself and replenish itself. So you can see here in figure A, the plants do look a little spaced apart, but if you look underneath the soil, because they're being grazed appropriately, if you look underneath the soil, you'll see those roots intermingle. And that is eliminating undesirable species, weeds, all that kind of thing to come through. Then if you look in slide in the figure C, you see a lot of dense, very, very unhealthy root mass. We're declining that root mass, and we see some weed species starting to come through the soil. So this kind of shows that overgrazing your plants over time definitely has its effect on overall plant health. So that's why management intensive grazing is very, very important. Now, if your pasture contains most, it's a pure grass stand pasture, it is going to require some applications of nitrogen in the form of commercial fertilizer or manure to continue to be productive. Pastures with less than 25% legumes are considered a grass pasture. And then if your pasture has over 25% in legumes, you typically don't need that additional nitrogen. Legumes fix nitrogen from the air into the form of back into the soil. So it helps replenish that nitrogen that's lost through the grass plants. So some clovers or some legumes that are typical that you might see are alfalfa, clover, vetch, trefoil, some of the legumes that you can add into that grass stand to help fix that nitrogen back into the soil. Now there is this sweet spot of grazing. We call it the phases of grass growth and reproduction. So when we look at this growth curve and we see this optimal time to graze, and that is what we call phase 2. So when we have a plant that is freshly grazed and it's taken down to that take half, leave half, we start to see that regrowth come. And as it reaches phase 2, as you'll see in the screen where the X crosses, that is the best time to graze. That's phase 2, where we have palatable plant species, we have a healthy, nutritious plant species. The animals like it in that phase. And as it's grazed, to take half of that down, it'll regrow very nicely and stay in that phase 2. Now, once we reach a phase 3, where we have the flowering and the seeding of that plant, the palatability goes down. Animals don't like to necessarily eat it. It doesn't taste very well to them. And once we start grazing it, it's not going to grow back as easily. Those growth points on the grass will expand as it enters reproduction stage, which is that flowering and seeding stage, and we lose some growth potential of that plant. So it's best to keep it in that sweet spot of phase 2, where we give it some rest and recovery, graze it back down, rest and recovery, and then graze it back down to that same phase. So there's several terms associated with rotational grazing. And like I said, this is a very brief presentation where we're going to introduce some of those definitions, but there's a lot of room for research and knowledge in these definitions. So we're just going to kind of go through them and talk a little bit about them, so you have some idea of what they mean and what they are as defined in rotational grazing. So we have stocking rates, animal units, and stock density. An animal unit is commonly defined as 1,000 pounds of body weight. An AUM is the term we use to describe the amount of forage that an animal unit will consume in 1 month. So an animal unit per month is 1,000 pounds of animal weight and how much that animal will consume in forage in 1 month. So the chart shown here lists the different amounts of or specific animals and how many animal units those are. So you can see here a mature cow that does not have a calf is going to be about 1 animal unit or 1,000 pounds. A cow with a calf is going to be a little bit over an animal unit, 1.2. We look down, we have sheep, so 5 weaned lambs, 2 yearlings, are going to be a little over half of an animal unit. per their weight. So 5 of those. 5 mature ewes with or without lambs is going to be 1 animal unit. Let's see, what else do we have here? Horse. A mature horse is going to be a little over an animal unit, 1.125. 6 does with goats, looking at goats, 6 does with or without kids is going to be about 1 animal unit. So this gives you an idea of how many animals it takes to reach that animal unit. You have to evaluate your own animals specifically, but this gives you an idea of some of those weights. So moving on with some of those definitions that I want to introduce, we have what we call carrying capacity. And this is the stocking rate at which an animal performance can be achieved while maintaining the integrity of the resource base. So basically, how much feed is there? How much feed is on your property? That is your carrying capacity of how much you have forage availability. The stocking rate is how much feed you take. So essentially, the carrying capacity equals the stocking rate. And these can be very confusing, like I said, so we're introducing them, and I'm going to show you a little graphic that maybe will make that a little more clear. With stock density, it's the other definition we want to define. This is the number of animals in a particular area at any moment in time, and it increases as the number of animals in the paddock increases, or as the paddock size decreases. And it's based on how often you're rotating, how your grazing management works. So stock density helps increase the uniformity of grazing. It increases the competition of animals. When you have a stock density area or a paddock, it increases the uniformity of what they're grazing. The animals are all in competition, and they're less selective. They're trying to eat before the other animals get what they think that they should eat. So this helps improve the distribution of manure and nutrient cycling throughout that paddock. And here is the illustration to kind of show you. The units of stock density and stocking rate are the same, but the concept is very different. So 100 animals, for instance, 100 animals for 1 day results in uniform grazing. There we go. So 100 animals for 1 day results in uniform grazing, or 1 animal for 100 days results in under or overgrazing. So that kind of gives you an idea of stock density versus stocking rate. If we have those 100 animals in a paddock for 1 day and then move them on to the next paddock, we see a lot more uniform grazing than if we just turn one out for 100 days. So this slide illustrates just a couple varieties of rotational grazing paddocks. Like I said, there is no one size fits all. It's a lot of trial and error and what resources you have on your own property. But here's just some ideas of how others have set it up. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be as elaborate as you want it to be. There's a lot of room for however it fits your property. You can see that, several different pastures around with a area that you can get into the water tank in this first picture. There's a corral there, and then those animals can be pushed into each pasture. That looks very probably expensive and a lot of infrastructure to get that one set up. You can see in the bottom one, there's a holding pasture and then 6 different paddocks with the little alleyway. There's some perimeter fencing that we'll talk about and some interior fencing in the middle. And that also is very intense to set up as well. In the picture on the right, you can see it's very a portable fencing system. They're moving those animals throughout each paddock. They're moving their water in each of those. So that is a little bit probably more management intensive because they have to move more often and are rotating throughout the whole pasture area and moving their water. But here's just some idea of a few different grazing paddocks to kind of give you an idea of how others have set them up. It is important to have a sacrificial area on your property as well. So we might have these great pastures and these paddocks that we're rotational grazing our livestock, but it's important to have this area where you sacrifice. You just let it go. It helps protect your pastures from damage, especially when there's high rainfall. Say the soil is really wet. You don't want to cause any soil compaction or trampling. So you have this sacrificial area where you put your livestock until the pasture is ready to be grazed. It's a heavy use area, and it provides an area for taking care of some management, maybe vaccinations or working your animals, and an area for supplemental feeding. If you need to add grain or hay, this is a great place to feed your animals as well. So sacrificial areas are really good in the rotational grazing system to help make sure you keep your pastures healthy throughout, even when it's heavy rainfall or snowfall or any of those weather conditions. We're going to talk a little bit about pasture poultry. I know a lot of people that have been taking this class are interested in grazing their pasture with poultry. It is recommended that each bird has 5 square feet per bird in the pasture area. So as a recommendation to kind of give you an idea of how much space that they are required for how many birds that you have. There's several advantages to grazing poultry on pastures. For sure, feed savings. Forage can provide a large amount of feed, reducing that amount needed to buy. I've seen research that has shown that pastured poultry can get 5 to 20% of their diet from pasture. Typically in the late spring and early fall is when the poultry will use this feed source the most, which is typical for our growing seasons. And it's a great nutrition source. Plant matter is high in vitamins and minerals. It's got fiber, protein, energy, omega-3s, all things that are very nutritious for poultry. So just a few things related to grazing your poultry. The time of the day is important. Right before sunset is when poultry will consume the most vegetation. They like to fill up before they start roosting. But they're also most aggressive at grazing 2 hours pre-daylight. So if you are really up and at 'em, you can get your birds out there a couple hours early before daylight and get them grazing. They're the most aggressive then. It does take time to adapt those birds, so they need to be taught how to graze those pastures. Some possible ways to introduce poultry to grazing would maybe to take some lawn clippings, put it in and get them used to grazing some of that pasture. Shade and shelter definitely encourages foraging. Birds don't like to be just out in the open. They like to have some type of shelter to protect and some shade, and that will help increase and encourage that foraging. Poultry prefer to graze on short grass that's around 2 inches, and it's useful we've talked about this, it's useful to graze some ruminant animals, some cattle or sheep beforehand, and then bring poultry in to complement that area. And some of the most favorite grass species that poultry like would be perennial rye, fescues, meadowgrass, or creeping bent are some of the ones that they prefer. So that's just a little on pasture poultry. I want to talk a little bit about fencing. So with rotational grazing, fencing is a must, and it's expense at first, but it's going to help you out in the long run to really increase that production of your pastures. Perimeter fencing is what's installed around the boundary of the property, around the boundary of the grazing area. And it's the first line of defense against predators. And we know that predators happen in almost all of our small farms. We'll have predators. So this perimeter fencing is the first line of defense. It is intended to last for a long time, and should be really researched and using good quality materials to put this perimeter fence in. Some ideas would be high tensile wire, lots of posts, corner systems, gates. And the purposes of this perimeter fence would be to keep your animals or your animals in, other animals out, and help create a safe boundary for those animals. So there also can be some permanent subdivision fence, which is some permanent fencing that you could put in for your paddocks around inside of the parameter fencing. And this can divide the larger acreage into those smaller zones to manage. Also, if you have, like some of the pictures we saw, the alleyways that are used for watering, those kind of concepts, this is a good type of fence to use to put in for those systems. So these can be, there's so many different variations of fencing. They can be a single strand of high tensile electric wire with solid corners or line posts that wildlife cannot knock off the wires is a good avenue. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then when you have your grazing systems and you've decided how to set up your paddocks and how to rotate your animals and where you want them to go, portable fencing is a huge, huge, huge tool to use. And we're very great advocates for portable fencing. It's temporary, it's flexible. You have to train those animals to use it, but it's easy to move. Commonly we use some poly wire or poly tape with fiberglass posts, and you can move those and reshape those paddocks how your grass is growing and really help to manage it in a efficient way. But you do have to train your animals to it. Definitely, I know Melissa talked about goats being a little more curious animals. They need more voltage than cattle do, especially if cattle have been trained to that fencing. It's a psychological type of barrier, so you really have to train those animals to it. But about 3,000 volts is required for goats just to keep them in, because they are very curious animals, and more wires. So just to kind of go through some of the permanent fencing that you could typically use would be mesh wire with small openings, like a diamond mesh. There's diamond mesh wires, or there's two wires twisted together. Different types of mesh wires could be used. Bob wire fencing can be used. Maybe wood or vinyl fencing could be a great permanent fence type of material. Maybe rejuvenating old fences that you have and reestablishing those. Some temporary fencing could be, some ideas could be high tensile or poly wire and poly tape. You can use step-in posts or fiberglass posts, T-post. Electric netting can be used. So there's a lot of different ideas, and this is just to kind of introduce you to some fencing materials. There's a lot of research out there and what works best for your property and how easy accessible a lot of this is. So here's just some ideas of some fencing to use to establish this rotational grazing system. And here's just some recommended number of wires and post spacing for different animals to kind of give you an idea when you get started building this. Cow calf, especially calm cow calf pairs, sometimes they only just need one wire that's 28 to 34 inches in height. Sheep and cattle start smaller at 10 inches from the ground, 20 inches, and then 32 inches to keep them in. If you look down for perimeter fences, sheep and goats, they need about 8 wires to really keep them in and keep predators out, starting very low from the ground and then moving its way up. So this just gives you an idea of some recommended numbers of wires, per species, just to help eliminate predators from coming in and get you started on putting in fencing for a rotational grazing system. So like I said, it's very, very fast. There's a lot you can talk about with rotational grazing and management intensive grazing and fencing. And when I first started, I attended the Lost Rivers Grazing Academy, which is in Salmon, Idaho every year. It's a 4-day intensive workshop, and it definitely takes 4 days to really understand a lot of these concepts. But it's very, very much a trial and error, and just working and trying to figure out different things, changing it up if it's not working. And definitely, I like this quote: growth is a process of trial and error and experimentation. And that falls definitely in line with management intensive grazing, rotational grazing. And what might have worked one year doesn't necessarily work the next year. So with that, are there any questions?
You do have questions, Ricky. Thanks for that introduction to rotational grazing.
Perfect.
So I'll just start at the top and say, your first question is, can different species be in the same pasture at the same time? If so, which ones?
Well, I think that depends on your farm and what animals you've already had together. Definitely they all, like we said, have different grazing habits. So maybe it's not best to have them all grazing together, but it can be done. I know I've seen other people graze their cattle and their sheep together, but just knowing that they're different grazing habits. Hopefully that kind of answers.
Okay, thank you. Another question: does continuous grazing also reduce root regrowth due to soil compaction?
Oh yes, definitely. Continuously grazing will eliminate a lot of vegetation above the soil, which then causes more erosion, more compaction, more weeds, more everything. So continuously grazing is not the best idea for a productive pasture.
Now there's a question about horses. It says, horses are known for ruining pasture faster than cows. I see that the animal units are not that different. Are they rotated more frequently, meaning the cows, or are they treated differently? Why do you think this is?
So a horse will actually pull the entire root out. That's why they ruin a pasture a lot faster. The way that they graze is a lot different than a cow. And I don't know the technical terms, but horses will basically pull the entire root out of the pasture. So it is really important to graze them probably a less amount of time, and really watch your pasture, because they are very selective. If you notice, if you drive around and kind of look at pastures that are just full of horses, you'll see a lot of high and a lot of low spots. And that has to do with being very selective animals and pulling those roots out. So it's very important to watch those two separately. And that's probably why you hear a lot of horses ruin pastures a lot quicker than cattle do.
Thank you. Okay, another question about grazing. If grazing grass is in phase 2, does it prevent it from going to seed and therefore propagate future grass growth? Do you need to reseed grass?
And that is one of those great answers where we say it depends. It depends on the species of grass that you have in there. Typically in the fall, it's a good idea to let that grass go to seed, so it does have that time to replenish itself before it goes dormant. But it depends on the grass plant. A lot of grass plants they're regrowing from the root mass underneath and the rhizomes. So not necessarily does it have to go to that reproductive stage to stay productive.
And do the animals pass viable seed, like through their manure?
Oh yes, definitely. So if you have animals that you have purchased and they've been in a very highly infested weed pasture, they are going to bring those weed seeds into your properties. It's really, really important to have a sacrificial area like we talked about, and introducing those animals in that sacrificial area ahead of time to try to eliminate some of that weed seed or other grass seed that they've been eating to go into your pastures.
Great, thank you. Another question, and this is from Sandpoint. What is Lespedeza? I'm not sure I'm saying that right. And is it typically planted in a mix of legumes or as a standalone species for fixing nitrogen?
I'm least familiar with that legume, and so I'd have to do some research for you. It's not something that's typically planted around here, so I'd have to do some research. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what that one is.
Okay, great. Well, we do have another question about clovers. Are all clovers suitable for grazing? And do you have suggested varieties that you prefer?
I would never plant clover because no matter what you plant in your property or your pasture, you're going to end up with clover. It comes from the water, the irrigation sources, overwatering, you can get clover. So I would never actually plant a clover. You'll end up with some clover. Typically, even the greatest managed pastures will end up with some clover. I would say, I mean, it depends on the species. So it's really hard to give a one size fits all on clover. It depends on what animal you're grazing to what they'll like the best. But I would never actually plant clover. I would stick with some other legume because you'll end up with clover just through the water.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions we have for you right now, Ricky.
All right, thank you.
So thanks for that great presentation. Our next presenter, you actually see, I believe, in this slide, is Peter Dill, and he's going to be talking about the small herd dairy exemption in Idaho. And so I am actually going to stop sharing my screen so that Caldwell can share their screen, and Peter is going to take you through some different websites. So I've stopped sharing my screen, and Ariel, you are welcome to share your screen.
Good morning. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this course. It's a great course, and I'd like to thank each of you. Sustainable and organic agriculture is the way of the future, and I'm grateful for the good work that you all are doing. So we have a few minutes together, and let me ask briefly one question: why raw milk? And I'll answer it, and then you can think about your answer to it at your point, at your leisure. So raw milk will help you be more intelligent, better looking, and even more charming than usual. And I think it's true. The reality also is that raw milk is very good for you, and it's a delicate food, so bacteria can be a concern. Therefore, care is important. It's also a strong food, and bacteria aren't all alike. Some are very good for you, so it's helpful. But we begin with why raw milk, because it is a product that is regulated. Some people have large concerns, and we'll be walking through some of those concerns. But at the end of the day, you'll hear the report of the Department of Agriculture from yesterday about how it's all going, and actually it's going really well. So looking at the ISDA website, there is a description of raw milk, and embedded in this website are a number of links that I'd like to take you to, because all of them are important for you to be able to understand. And what I'll do is show you the tools first, and then we can look at some particulars. But if you look at the top, there's a link, IDAPA 0204, etc. And if we click on that, we'll come to using someone else's computer. So let's see. Here we go. Something new happened.
Since we're talking about technical difficulties, I did have one person put in the chat that your sound is very quiet, Peter.
Okay. We just moved the microphone.
That does make it a little bit better. Thank you.
Okay, maybe just talk about it because it's not showing.
Okay. Well, then let's go back to the page, to the web page. All right, well, Ariel's doing this, so I'll repeat the first line, and that is, why raw milk? You'll be more intelligent, better looking, and more charming than usual. If you missed that, that's too bad. That was a good line. Okay, so here's the, we're back at the raw milk page for the Department of Agriculture. And my point in showing you the way around this is that there are good tools here. So at the top, you'll see the IDAPA 020413 reference that if you click on it, you'll get to the raw milk rules, the administrative rules for raw milk in Idaho. I encourage you to read these. Further down, you'll see a plus and a link for the small herd exemption. If you click on that, you'll see two things. One is a summary of the raw milk rules, the basic requirements to be a raw milk producer, and then also a form to register. It's a one-page form, and you can use it to apply to be a licensed raw milk producer in Idaho. Below that is a similar link to the herd share program, and the same information is there. It's a summary of the basic requirements and a form to apply. Down at the bottom of the menu on the left is the Dairy Bureau contacts, and Martha Walby's name is there as the raw milk technician. She's a fine person and helpful, was the assistant to Marv Patton, who was the director of the Dairy Bureau for years and years and years, and a real help in getting raw milk rules passed here in Idaho. So those are the basics. Since I can't click on them, I'll just tell you a little bit about them. The short story on the small herd exemption is that you can have 3 lactating cows or 7 lactating sheep if you want to legally sell or provide raw milk for human consumption for other than your immediate household or non-paying guests. All right, that was a mouthful, but all of those words are meaningful because they affect the number of cows you can have or the number of goats you can have, and who you provide raw milk to. You're not limited to 3 cows on your farm. You're limited to 3 lactating cows, and I'll use cows instead of goats. Don't mean to ignore the goat people, but I'll just do it this way for efficiency. 3 lactating cows for sale, for human consumption. And that doesn't include your house. It doesn't include the people who are non-paying guests. It doesn't include cows who are nursing calves or where the milk is being used to feed pigs or fertilize your field. But it's 3 for this purpose of selling raw milk. And you need to test the milk, and it needs to be tested from those 3 cows. We'll talk a little bit about that process. The 3 cows need to be tested, both the cows and the milk. The cows need to be tested for tuberculosis and brucellosis on an annual basis. And the cows obviously have to have a bangs vaccine. The milk will be tested regularly for for drugs and for different bacteria. It's a test that is not hard to pass, although occasionally, and sometimes it's time of year related or time of lactation related, you won't pass, but it's not a difficult test generally to pass if you're up on cleanliness and general care at your place and with your animals. I'm so glad that this is in the context of pasturing that we're speaking, because grazing cattle goes a long ways to having healthy animals and then healthy milk. the summaries that are referred to under the small herd exemption and the herd share exemption have charts which tell you about the allowable standard plate count, the allowable somatic cell, the allowable coliform numbers, and those are important in the charts. We're limited on time, so I won't go through those in detail. If you have a question about it, trying to save a little bit of time for that. There's going to be a reference in your materials to a farm plan. It's a management plan that the Washington State University Extension Service put together for a raw milk dairy in North Idaho. It's a long plan. You don't have to have one of those, but it's good to read because it tells you about how the Little Bear Dairy in North Idaho has organized their farm and states a number of management observations and tools. So I recommend that you read it. It's really useful to have your operation organized. I know you've been learning about that, and I know you already thought about it before you came, but having things organized is really helpful. And it's also helpful when you deal with the Department of Agriculture. Also in the materials will be a link to a website, which is, it's a nicely done website explaining about raw milk. It's another actually multifaceted small farm in, I think in North Idaho, that again, gives you an idea of what some people are doing in presenting both the idea around raw milk and also the marketing of it. And they do other animals, so if you have other animals that you're interested in doing in a combined farm operation, it'll give some good ideas. And then I've also suggested that that we include a Boise Weekly article from 8 years ago, which gives some background on how the new raw milk rules in Idaho came into play. And it has a little color to it, but it will give you a picture. Now, I would tell you briefly about history because an ounce of history is worth a pound of logic. But if we want to get to that, we can afterwards, and the history is in itself interesting. The history just will tell you why there's some stress around raw milk, and there is. But some people get uptight about it, and there have been some experiences in the past that have been hard. Thankfully, those have not been the case in Idaho. And many of the problems with raw milk are decades and decades ago. But raw milk is really good for you, and it's good for the people that you serve. So I'm thankful and proud of you for all the work that you're doing. I will say that Martha at the Department of Agriculture told me yesterday that the program is going really well. Those were her words. She said people are enjoying raw milk and they're enjoying farming. And I was surprised to learn how many permits they have issued over the 8 years that this has been underway. And they've issued 275 permits for raw milk, both cows and goats. That's incredible, quite frankly. And what's also incredible is that, now not all of those are current, but that's the number of permits that they've issued. What's also incredible is that there have been no outbreaks of illness in Idaho. And that is a credit to the producers. So the last thing I'll tell you is an interesting bit of news, and that is that one of the candidates for governor of Idaho drinks raw milk. And I won't steal his thunder, so I won't tell you who he is, but maybe he'll announce it sometime. Do you have questions? If so, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
So you started talking about raw milk issues and potential problems, but you didn't address any of those. Do you want to clarify or expound on any of that?
Well, the problems that can occur with raw milk are the same problems that occur with pasteurized milk and with other foods. people can get sick. And the illnesses are of different kinds, but the foodborne illnesses that are common in different foods can be common in raw milk. So I'm not sure.
I am going to,
And I was just going to
this
say,
is Colette.
we are not going to have Peter later this afternoon. So if there are questions, he has graciously offered to answer them later on his own time. And we will try to collect all of those. And we'll be putting all the resources that he mentioned on the student website as soon as possible.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you, Peter. We wanted to really thank you for your time this morning and your presentation and for the comprehensive list of resources that you provided.
You're very welcome.
We're now going to move to our last speaker before lunch, and this is Melissa Line. She's going to be talking about grass-fed steers and pastured pigs. We are just about 10 minutes behind schedule, so we may go into a little bit of our lunch hour, but we do have some more time and flexibility in the afternoon since Peter is not available for our farmer panel. So we'll adjust as we go, and welcome, Melissa. I will share control of the slides with you now. Iris, you have control of the slides for Melissa. And you're muted. So Iris, if you could unmute, that would be great.
Okay. One more time.
Not sure what happened with that.
Okay, are you hearing me now, Colette?
I do hear you, but there has been an adjustment to the screen sharing somehow. So I am going to have to give you control of the screen if I'm seeing things correctly.
Screen setting has been changed.
So I'm going to try sharing the screen again. There we go. So everyone should now see the full slideshow on their screen, and control is going back to you, Iris and Melissa.
You have control
in
now.
Moscow.
So. Okay, hi everybody. Hopefully, can you hear me now? This is Melissa Lines, and I spoke to you a little bit earlier about the various species of livestock, and what I'm going to do now is focus on where I am now on my farm, which is finishing steers and pigs over the summer months only. I don't keep breeding animals anymore because after 21 years of sheep, it was time for a change. There's something really, let's go to the next slide, please. There's an added, okay, let me start off. I purchase animals in the spring from local farmers, feed them out over the summer on my pastures, and direct market them to families in my region in the fall. This is a good model for me because at a different time in my life, I wanted to cut back a little bit on work. It's also an excellent way to test drive a species of animals. And this is highly recommended by me as well as many other experts. If you're thinking of raising a species for meat, beef, pigs, whatever, sheep, it's just so helpful to go get a few in the spring, feed them out over the summer, have them slaughtered, sell them, and then step back and think about that. How did you feel about the process? Did it work with your labor availability, with your particular farm, all of your resources? It's a far better idea than, and I've known people who've done this, go out and buy 10 or 20 breeding animals. You've never had these animals before. Just jump right in feet first. I've known so many people who've done that and had high losses because unfortunately in the beginning sometimes there's a learning curve and sometimes animals are going to die, and it's a pretty expensive way to learn. By just going spring to fall, you know real fast in 6 months, oh, this is not for me. Or maybe you want to go further and learn more about it and buy breeding stock. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, all right, I'll advance the slides. I'll start out with talking about the beef. I purchase every spring only about 10 or 15 yearling steers. That's the number that works for me on my farm, my operation, my willingness to work. I like beef breeds. I particularly like Angus and Angus Hereford crosses. They do well. It's really important to me, and this goes to where you're going to get your animals. And I kind of want to beat you over the head about this because it's so important. What some people do is go to their local sale yard where farmers and ranchers just run thousands and thousands of animals through a sale yard every year. You go there, you buy animals, and with most sale yards, you don't get to know who raised the animals. You don't get to know what kind of farm they came from, what their management procedures were. And also, since so many animals go through a sale yard, it's very likely there were some sick ones, and they're shedding pathogens in their snot, in their feces. Other animals are picking them up. You just don't know what you're going to get. You don't know what you're bringing onto your farm. So I urge you, please, buy from farmers. Find local farmers. I go to Spokane for some of my pigs. I mean, they don't have to be down the road from you, but find local farmers, go to their farm, look at their place, look at their operation, look at all of their animals, not just the ones that are for sale, and decide if you want to bring those animals onto your place. Okay, so I have a group of farmers that I buy from. I'm real happy with their animals. They perform well for me in my situation. They're grass-fed herds, and these people raise the animals just the way I would if I wanted to keep a breeding herd and raise them myself. So whatever you decide, however you want your animals raised, that's what you need to seek out those people. One of the things I always look for, and this is really important for me, is once I'm doing the farm walk, is are the animals calm? All of them, not just a few. Are they calm? Or does this farmer chase them around in a four-wheeler, yelling at them, waving whips in the air? They're going to be very hard to deal with at home, especially since you only have them for a short period of time. They don't live their whole lives. Well, they live the rest of their lives at your place, but they don't live 10 years at your place to have time to get to know you. Look for calm, well-adjusted animals. If the farmer has used electric fence, that's a plus. I'm much more likely to buy from him because these steers that I bring home are going to spend the whole summer in one strand of electric fence. In some of the pastures, I also have some field fencing, but I want them to respect electric. That's really helpful. I like to start them at weighing about 600 to 800 pounds, which is kind of average for a year-old steer. And then over the course of the summer, they're going to gain probably around 300 pounds, sometimes 400 on my pastures. One more time, buy from the farm, please. Okay. I'm switching to the next slide. Iris, help? Yeah, we're stuck. Sorry, everybody. Okay, stop. Yeah, I know. Oh, so don't point it at the screen. I'm sorry, everybody.
I'm happy to advance your slides, Melissa, if you would prefer. Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, may we have the next slide then? I'm sorry, everybody. You know, technology, geez. Okay, so I mentioned bringing new animals to your farm brings challenges. It's not like these animals are going to spend 10 years with you under this model. So I've worked out some systems that work well for me, bringing strange animals in, getting them acclimated, calm, relaxed, used to me in as short a period of time as possible, and get them out in my pastures, because seems insane to me to bring strange animals home in a trailer, drive out into your pasture, unload them, and just let them go. They don't know your place. They don't know the smells, the other animals. They don't know the predators. They don't know the taste of the grass. They don't know you. It's all brand new and they're scared. So my system is I bring them into one of two paddocks. They're about 100 by 200. That's surrounded by field fencing. That was my original sheep fencing. And I put a strand of electric on top just to make sure. And this place serves as a training area to get used to moving around. Here, cows, we're going to go to fresh pasture. Everybody has their own whistle or call. I say, here, cows. They learn that in like 2 days. Oh, fresh grass, got it. They're not as dumb as they look. Another huge benefit is this is a quarantine area. If perchance they came to me sick, hopefully in the next week or 10 days, they're going to start showing signs. Because if there's a sick animal, I want to segregate him, and I don't want him to put him out in my pastures. They acclimate to the new farm and spring grass. Sometimes I get them late April. Sometimes they haven't been on pasture yet at their farm. And you do not want to take an animal who's been on hay and throw them into lush, thick, tall green grass immediately. At the very least, it's going to cause stomach upsets, next diarrhea, next worse. Do it slowly. And also, this is important. One of my mottos is that an old farmer taught me is, and this is in capital letters above my head, visualize this, a fluorescent sign, all caps, it says, make every day a good day, including the last day of their lives. So in this system, the animals start out with me in the spring in the same place where I'm going to bring them for on-farm slaughter. The last day of their lives, they're like, oh, I know this place. They go in, start eating grass. It's very calm, relaxed. It's a wonderful situation. Okay, and that red arrow goes to one strand of electric, and I just want to point out that sheep in that pasture obviously walks underneath that fence. I now have 2 pet sheep, and they pretty much get to go where they want. That would not contain a sheep. Next slide, please. Okay, my rotational grazing plan is I have given the steers 50 acres of my place, and I have it subdivided into 13 pastures. Some are field fencing. Most of them are one strand of electric. My grazing plan is pretty simple. I like to give them cattle like taller grass than sheep or goats. I like to turn it in when it's around 10 or 12 inches and only take around half, as Ricky was saying. It provides it leaves the most amount of leaf surface for the plant to regrow. Because if they eat it down to nothing, there's a ½ inch of leaf surface to collect sunlight, do the miracle of photosynthesis, and regrow. And I like to go through twice every summer. Rotate varies, depends on the size of the pasture, what the season is like. This is one of the fun things about raising livestock, or actually raising anything. You need to be outstanding in your field. This is not my idea, it's someone else's phrase, but it's so appropriate. You go out there, I'm out there every couple of days looking at the grass, deciding, okay, is it time? Is it time? Maybe in 2 days I'll move them. And it varies from the spring when you're moving them real fast because the grass is growing fast, to later in the summer, you're moving them more slowly because the grass is growing more slowly. And as in most things in life, please have a plan B. I always have some nice alfalfa hay in the barn, just in case we have, like we've had for the last 3 summers, an early, hot, dry summer. No, long, hot, dry summer. Because this has been shown in numerous studies, you want to harvest an animal when he's in a stage of actively growing. You do not want to harvest an animal when his nutritional level is declining, he's starting to lose weight. It dramatically impacts flavor. So the last several years I've been supplementing a little bit of alfalfa for the last maybe 3 weeks before slaughter. Just be prepared, plan B. Next slide, please. This is a culmination of a summer's worth of work. This is one of my steers being slaughtered. I haven't pre-scheduled them for October. Depending on your community, you may want to do that early. I just made my reservations for October at the end of February to get the dates that I wanted, because these custom slaughterhouses are so busy with especially fair pigs, fair beef, fair animals. Kids will often raise several of a species and only pick one to take to the fair, and then the others get slaughtered. So they're just mobbed, not to mention all the sale animals from the fair. So think about it. Don't wait till 2 weeks before you think it's time and go, well, I think I'll call a slaughterhouse now. You might be sorry. You might be having to wait till December or January. My local custom processor has a truck. You can see a little bit of it there. Comes out, kills the animal, quick and clean, right in his field. Cleans it, takes it to his facility for hanging, and then does the cutting wrapping there. Okay, next slide, please. I'm moving on to, the pigs. Each spring, around 15 pigs is good for me right now, although it's a growing market, and 15 pigs are good for the pastures I'm using now, kind of near the house. I'm preparing and gearing up to move them out into my woods pastures, which are much further away from the house and need more infrastructure. Then I can grow numbers more. I like 8-week-old pigs that are weaned and eating solid food real well. I like heritage breeds. These particular pigs are called Gloucester Old Spot. It's an old breed. And what's great about the old breeds is physiologically, they're still able to process grass. They aren't designed to live inside a facility on concrete with fans and fluorescent lights being fed nothing but grain their entire lives. These guys know how to survive. And I, just like with the steers, buy pigs from the farm. If you find a farmer, the first thing you do is say, okay, let's schedule a visit. Don't reserve the pigs. Go look at the farm, look at all the animals, talk about their system before you commit. You don't want to bring disease onto your farm every year. You can just see that exploding into a nightmare. If you've brought sickly animals every year over time, your place is going to be so unhealthy, it's toxic. Okay, next slide, please. Feed. My pigs have access to lush green pasture like that every day. Lucky pigs. Plus, they also get fruit and veggies. I start with the first fruit that comes on in my place is the pie cherries, late May or so. I pull them off the tree and pigs love them. I feed them also a non-GMO local grain from Eric Zachariasen, by the way, for the local people here. He's outside of Palouse. It's right out of his farm field, sustainably raised, non-GMO. And I want to think about buying bulk. I bought a funky old 70s pickup bed trailer, homemade trailer, and I use that to haul a ton or ton and a half of pig feed to my place. And what's great about that is I can park it near where the pigs are. So feeding is easier. It's not like there's a silo over there and I have to transport feed every day or every week. And the price is phenomenal. If a 50-pound bag of feed is $18 in the store, which, yeah, I think it's even more than that now, 19, that's 36 cents a pound. At $3.15 a ton, I'm paying 16 cents a pound. So 20 cents savings, okay, big deal. Times 2,000 pounds, there's $400, it adds up. And you're not making as many trips. Actually, some people go once every couple of weeks to the feed store. It just doesn't seem very efficient. By the way, I mentioned earlier in my first few years of raising livestock, I raised for 5 or 6 years, 200 meat chickens every year. And somebody suggested this, and I thought, what the heck? I called my local feed store and said, I'm going to buy about 1,000 pounds of chicken feed this year. Can you give me a ton rate or a discount? And he said, sure. So, you know, it's worth a try. What the heck? He wants your business. Next slide, please. Pigs really love pasture. I mean, that right-hand picture, those pigs are running to me because I've called, here, pig, but they're happy. They love it. They're made for it. My pigs have 24/7 access to a barn for shade and one paddock. They can't have the whole place. They have to get metered out. I rotate the pigs just like I do the cattle. Next slide, please. The plan for the pigs is they move into the pastures that I started the cows out in, and got the cows in late April. The pigs move in there in May when the grass is regrown. They have 200 by 200 foot paddocks that I've subdivided for a total of 8. Plus you always have a plan B in case it's a hot, dry summer, grass goes fast. And the key to saving these pastures so you can reuse them year after year, not having to till it and replant it, is the minute you're out there looking every day, as soon as they start rooting, you're out of here. Because they will eat the tall, lush, beautiful stuff first, and they won't start the rooting until they've eaten it down. In the foreground is where these pigs just were. I just moved them into the new paddock there. That's electric wire separating the 2 paddocks. And the bottom half of the picture, you don't want it to go any shorter than that. That's where you want it to be in order to save it so you can reuse it year after year. And I use a 2-year rotation. They go to one set of pastures and a barn one summer, another set of pastures and barn the next summer, and then back, simply for disease and parasite control. Okay, next slide. I want to talk real briefly about marketing. As I said, I sell beef and pigs to families in the area, and this is key by advance reservation with deposit. And that's one of the things my starter herd of chickens taught me. First year, I only raised 50 chickens, sold them all to my friends. They said, oh yeah, I want some chickens. And then the week before butchering day, some people canceled. They had made no commitment other than a verbal. Things change, you know. Bam, from that year forward, I've always required a deposit. It's a commitment, and that cash flow really helps. Helps you buy feed, supplies, charge a deposit. My customers, the vast majority are repeats. They tell their friends, referrals, people talking, but search engines, having a website is so valuable. I started out with a website in 2000. That's why this looks a little bit outdated. This is my website. But virtually all of my new customers have come through the website. People refer me, they say, go to our website. They go to my website and learn all about the whole system, figure it all out, so that they aren't calling me at 8 o'clock at night asking me all these detailed questions. It's more efficient, you know, and it instills confidence in you as a producer. That's the web address, and that's it. That's my presentation. It's noon. I know you guys are ready to go to lunch. There might be some questions, Colette?
There are some questions. So the first one is the non-GMO pig feed that you buy locally also organically produced? And the second part to that question is, can you raise a market pig organically?
Okay. The feed that I buy is from Eric Zachariasen outside of Palouse, and he's an industrial farmer. They have a few thousand acres, and he's set aside 400 acres that he uses to grow non-GMO crops with a minimal use of herbicides and fertilizer. Well, no, he does fertilize. He tries his best, and there is no organic grain locally. I know there's some outside of Sandpoint, but there isn't any available around here. And you also have to factor in the cost. How expensive is it compared to your profitability? I'm sorry, the second half of that, Colette, the second half of the question is, can you raise a pig organically?
Yes.
I don't see why not. if you want a pig, if you want to sell certified organic meat, you have to feed it certified organic. There are regulations. Certified organic feed. You can't put non-certified organic hay out on your fields. You know, there are certain requirements, but there's no reason whatsoever.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a couple clarifying questions about your 2-year rotation. Does that mean that you don't graze that pasture at all, or you just graze it with a different animal in the in-between years?
That's a good question. Yes. I definitely do not let it sit for 2 years. It gets grazed by other animals. Because even now in my reduced farm size, I have 2 horses, the steers every summer, the pigs every summer, and 2 sheep that are backup lawnmowers. No, I definitely keep grazing it.
Great, thank you. How much of a deposit do you require from your customers?
A little higher than a lot of people do. Initially, I was, say, on a whole steer, a few hundred. But as time went on, I realized part of the deal is cash flow. You've got to work out a way to keep your cash flow as consistent as possible throughout the year, because it's tough if you only get paid in the fall, for example. I myself, it's hard to budget for a year, you know, make your money last. So I arrived at the figures I did based on what does it cost me to buy that steer? That's what I want the deposit to be. And on the pig, what does it cost me to buy the pig and feed the pig? And that's what the deposit is.
Okay, and that was another question. On average, what does it cost to buy a 600 to 800 pound steer?
Oh, buy the steers. My model is, and you know, it's not what everybody needs to do, but my model is I buy from farmers who traditionally have taken their animals to the sale yard. And at the sale yard, the price you get is what they're offering you that day, what someone bids on the animal. So, and then sale yards publish their market results for every sale they have on a website. So when my rancher delivers his steers, we go online together in my living room and we look at Davenport and Spokane and Lewiston, look at their most recent sale prices, and then I add 20 cents a pound because I want them to keep doing business with me. And I also pay for delivery. I mean, I pay them for delivery because I don't want to deal with going to get animals.
Great, thank you. Another question about your piglets. How long do you quarantine them prior to introducing them to your pastures?
It's about 2 weeks. I have a place, I give them a small area with grass. Small, I mean like 50 by 50, 30 by 30, about 2 weeks. And watch them closely.
Great. And do you ever have to irrigate your pastures?
No, never. In my entire area outside of Moscow, it's what's called dry land farming. Irrigating is on any scale is not feasible here. We don't have the water source. You know, like over in the Columbia Basin, they have the Columbia River. No, I never irrigate my pastures.
And do you know what your annual precipitation average is?
Nope. It's a lot more in the spring. That's about all I can say.
And that's something for the person who asked that question that you can go online and search what your annual precip is in your area. So what do you think is a good percent profit margin for grass finished animals?
Oh boy, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Yeah, it's going to be talked about. Katie's going to talk about that in great detail. Yeah.
Okay, so Kate Painter will cover that a little bit later today. So those are the questions that we have. Thank you very much. I'll say a little bit about how lunch is going to go. We're going to move into lunch, and at your sites you have about an hour for lunch. And then Janie Burns' presentation presentation has been recorded because she couldn't join us live today. So at each local site, you will view that presentation, which has been posted on YouTube. And then we won't join back into the live webinar until, I believe it is 2 o'clock this afternoon. So after you view Janie's webinar, you'll have a short break. And then we'll come back onto the live webinar at 2 o'clock with Kate Painter talking about the basics of creating livestock enterprise budgets. So have a really nice lunch and we'll reconvene at 2.